Well, welcome everyone to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I am your host, Luke Sheahan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. Today's episode is sponsored by the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Russell Kirk published his magisterial, The Roots of American Order, just under a half-century ago, where he famously argued for the influence of Judaic, classical, and Christian thought and history on the American founding and the American order more broadly. In that vein, today we are joined by Dr. Kody Cooper, and we should be joined shortly by Dr. Justin Dyer. Dr. Kody Cooper is UC Foundation Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Service at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He is author of Thomas Hobbes and the Natural Law. Dr. Justin Dyer is director of the Civitas Institute, professor of government, and Jack G. Taylor Regents Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I believe interim dean. Am I right on that?
You
He
are
is
right.
author of C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Natural Law, Slavery, Abortion, and the Politics of Constitutional Meaning, and Natural Law and the Anti-Slavery Constitutional Tradition. Together, they authored The Classical and Christian Origins of American Politics, Political Theology, Natural Law, and the American Founding, which is the subject of our discussion today. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I want to start off by discussing the narrative that, or one of the narratives that you guys are countering. So there's a certain narrative that sees the American founding, especially in light of the Declaration of Independence, as inherently secular, inherently bound up by materialistic presuppositions. So, for example, the reliability of human reason, natural rights, moral agency, and free will, where these are found in the founding documents and the writings of the founders, they're bereft of religious support. So they're thought of as independent of religious support. In fact, as far as this narrative goes, the God of nature in the Declaration is radically different from the God of Abraham. And the founding Americans preferred the God of nature and appealed to the God of nature over the Christian and Judaic God. You argue that this is incorrect. So let's get a sense for this narrative and why it's incorrect.
Well, Luke, first, let me apologize for one, coming in late, and two, dressing casually tonight. I was supposed to be teaching in a high school teacher workshop that got canceled, and so I was really delighted to be able to join the conversation. Kody was going to take it on his own, but I'm happy to be here. On the question that you had mentioned on the overall thesis, I had a dissertation committee member who said to me after I wrote a dissertation on natural law and anti-slavery constitutionalism, in which I argued that the Declaration of Independence and the natural rights and natural law teaching of the Declaration was central to the tradition that argued that the Constitution was anti-slavery. He said to me that I didn't go far enough in contemplating or considering and taking into account that the God of nature is not the God of Abraham. And then he went on to say that not only is natural law not an adjunct to the divine law, but it's a rival to the divine law in certain traditions, and that these things are radically different. And then he followed up by saying, if you think otherwise, there's an article or a book waiting to be written. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time and enlisted Kody in the project to write this book, and it started out as a series of articles that we did together. But we were thinking about that question, and we think that that's just not accurate in terms of how the American founders actually operated. But under one thesis, and this is not a popular thesis, in the divide between elite and popular. In the popular world, you're much more likely to find people who argue something that more closely aligns the founders with the Christian tradition. But in scholarship, you're much more likely to find people, especially in political theory, who argue that the founders, not only were they not Christians, but they were intentionally subversive of the whole Christian tradition that came before it. And one of the ways that they were subversive in this rendering is by equating natural law with nature's God. And nature's God in this rendering is tantamount to nature. And so it presupposes a pantheistic conception of the cosmos. Nature and God are the same thing. By saying nature's God, we're saying nature. And by appealing to nature, we're not appealing to anything beyond nature. There is no creator who is independent of and who sustains his creation. as in the God of Abraham. And so these things stand radically apart from each other, and they're different ways of providing a founding or a foundation for political thought. And as Kody and I work through this, we just think that the primary sources don't actually bear that thesis, and a lot of this, I think, point in the other direction. So that's a lot of what we're arguing in this book.
Well, let's start off with a discussion of kind of what is the kind of theological and philosophical assumptions of natural law that the American founders were working with.
Yeah, so we kind of have a thumbnail sketch, a summary of some of the ideas, and and it's some of it's really implicit in the concept of natural law. It implies having a lawgiver. There's no law without a lawgiver, and this lawgiver is seen as a divine creator, but this being is separate and distinct from the creation. So nature itself is not divine, but it's dependent upon God. So that's the rejection of pantheism. And the founders think that practical reason grasps the moral content of natural law as the goods that are proper to human beings that are required for their flourishing. And natural law is prescriptive, so it dictates certain duties and obligations. It's not mere hypothetical imperatives like if I want to live, I will not drink poison. It's there's a requirement to preserve life, as an example. And these principles and the goods they direct us to emanate from God, God's own nature, in which there's a simple unity of power and goodness. There's not this sort of tension or thought of that God is just this sort of super powerful being and he just dictates things and that's what makes them good. It's not that sort of horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. And so this idea of a pattern of sovereignty, God's governance of the universe in light of his goodness provides a pattern for civil sovereignty. And the political community is supposed to be powered on this power, and therefore a pattern on this, and therefore power should not be arbitrary. It's got to be tethered to the good. And so following from that, there's this idea of the rule of law. And it means that sovereign authority must be subject to the rule of law, understood as right reason or deductions from right reason. So might does not make right. And this idea of sovereignty, it originates in God, but it sort of flows from God to the whole people as manifest in their natural rights. And they exercise that legitimate sort of authority in governing themselves, but it's not absolute. It has intrinsic sort of limits. It's not a voluntaristic idea of sovereignty. And God continues to sustain the political order and is active in history, and even can intervene in human events. And natural law, therefore, is just one aspect of God's providential governance of the universe. So that's sort of, we unpack a lot of that more in the book, but those are some of the principles they assume.
And Kody's presenting there what we define as the classical Christian natural law tradition. And a lot of those assumptions then, as we present it, are part of the Christian tradition's engagement with classical philosophy. But at a basic level, we might even say that natural law, taking both parts of that term, both natural and law, that it's natural in the sense that it pertains to human nature. And the highest aspect in this classical tradition of human nature is our reason. And so the idea is that we know by reason certain things about the goods that are possible in this life and the way we ought to act and behave toward one another. And the law aspect is that it's actually obligatory on us, that there's a moral obligation in some sense. And people who have thought about this in the natural law tradition begin with that experiential reality. We have this sense that there are certain right ways of living and wrong ways of living, that human flourishing presupposes a standard of well-being, that there are right ways to live and wrong ways to live and to treat each other and all of those things. And that it's not just a matter of indifference, that these are actually obligatory on us, that we are guilty of violating a law in some sense. And as you go from the classical tradition to the Christian engagement with that tradition, when people started asking, well, how is it that we might have this kind of knowledge? And how is it that we might have this kind of law? God was central to the answer to that. That, well, it's because we're designed in a certain kind of way, that our minds function in a certain kind of way, and that God is the author of this law and actually establishes its obligation, the moral obligation of this law for us. But as they puzzled through the philosophical question, they went one step farther and asked, well, why is it obligatory on us? And one possible answer to that is, well, because God's powerful. And they decisively rejected that idea that, yes, of course he is powerful, but it's not by virtue of power alone. It's by virtue of power wedded to goodness. And so this goes back, as Kody mentioned, the Euthyphro question from Plato. And the question is about the relationship between goodness and power in God's nature. And the Christian answer to that, and the Trinitarian theology that comes forth from that, is that God is both good and powerful, and there's a unity in God's nature of goodness and power. And the American founders were well aware of this as a concept. They debated it. They learned about it in their moral philosophy classes. The clergymen who taught moral philosophy at the colonial colleges all addressed this specifically. And then they said that political sovereignty patterns itself after the model of divine sovereignty, so that goodness and power have to be united for there to be true political authority. And this answers the question of whether might makes right. And the answer was no, might does not make right. That might has to be united to right in order to give authority to the political community. And that, from there, I think, unfolds a lot of the presuppositions that lead to the American Revolution and lead into the Constitutional Convention and lead into the political tradition that we have in America.
Let's get into some details. So during the 1760s and 1770s, so leading up to the War for Independence, there are the pamphlet debates. So we get the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, the Townsend Acts, the various acts end up being called the Intolerable Acts. They're all measures enacted by Parliament that the American colonists disputed their legitimacy. What were the arguments, the three themes that show up in those debates, and how do they interrelate to each other?
Yeah, thanks. And it's a fascinating period of time to explore, to try to get into, because you really try to get inside the minds of the pamphleteers and the folks on the imperial side and the colonial side. But there were these themes about the economic health and well-being of the empire, and how we're going to arrange our trade relationships and tax relationships and duties and all this sort of thing, and what's going to be the most beneficial to the whole. And then, so that's one of the themes. And then another one is, the debate over the meaning of the Constitution and the English Constitution and the customs that animate, the colonies and their authority and, Parliament, et cetera. And then another sort of vector is the debate over first principles of what are those moral or political and moral first principles that are the very bedrock of society, of a good society, et cetera. And so, there with those sort of themes, we think we sort of divided up the period into sort of two stages. The first stage of the pamphlet debates, the second stage of the pamphlet debates. And the first stage is really triggered in 1765 by a Parliament's attempt. Okay, we're going to Stamp Act. We're going to start trying to raise revenues, and you can kind of understand the perspective of many in Parliament is, they're tens of million, I think 80 million pounds in debt for after the French anymore, the 7 Years' War, and they're trying to figure out how to raise funds. But on the other side, the Americans, they see some of these new duties as, look, this looks like it's something different than before. This looks like it's internal, and we've had a much more internal autonomy by custom. And if you're going to be doing this, we really should have a role of consulting. We should really have a role of consent. But in that first stage, what you find is that the Americans were not yet, shall we say, radicalized in the sense that they continue to accept parliamentary authority. They didn't dispute that Parliament had authority, but they were arguing, on the terms of that, this was unwise, this was unreasonable, etc. This would not be really good for the whole. Whereas the imperial pamphleteers are like, look, you're our colonies. We want to be a manufacturing powerhouse. You're going to provide us with the raw goods, And for many years, it looks like you might have been skirting some of these duties, and so we're just going to try to enforce the law now. That was sort of their perspective, and the Americans quickly find themselves in this kind of bind, kind of like a Chinese finger trap. If you stick your fingers in the trap of parliamentary authority, because now all of a sudden Parliament's going to say, well, we have the authority to bind you in all cases whatsoever, QED. We said so. So that's kind of, so they repeal the Stamp Act, but then they immediately have the Declaratory Act, which is to say, well, we have the power to do it if we want to. And that's really the rub, where the Americans sort of start to say, we got to pivot away, and they pivot away from that doctrine, the second stage of the pamphlet debates, the so-called Dominion theory, in which the Americans conceive of the Constitution as various co-equal legislatures that are united by loyalty to the king. And so that the House of Burgesses, the various legislatures in the colonies are not subject to Parliament as a superior. And that's what many of the founders come to argue in the second stage of the debates. And so you'll see in the Declaration of Independence, the arguments are addressed to the king. The Parliament's not even the Parliament is only obliquely referenced one time as trying to subject us to a foreign jurisdiction.
Yeah, and they actually mention acts of pretended legislation. And so the idea is that Parliament is illegitimate in terms of their authority over the colonies. And it does bring up a question, this is where natural law comes in, I think, is the question that the colonists are struggling with is what rights are they appealing to? Are they appealing to their rights as colonists or as subjects, or are they appealing to their natural rights? And I think the answer is both, that you actually get appeals to both. You have appeals both to the rights of man, both to natural rights, and this gets to the argument in first principles, but you also have a constitutional argument taking place within the British Empire itself. And they're arguing that Parliament does not have constitutional authority over them, and that their loyalty is to the crown, but that the crown has abdicated that responsibility, and the right to revolution ends up being a natural right that they're claiming in the Declaration of Independence. And we see the Declaration as the final stage of that debate that begins all the way back with the Stamp Act. And so you have the pamphlet debates, and you have the Declaration as a kind of culmination of the pamphlet debates, and culminating in this very explicit appeal to the laws of nature and of nature's God.
And let's talk a little bit more about the Declaration of Independence. So it does use this general language for God that we talked about, the God of nature. What was and you talked about the subversive political theology theory about why it does that. How is classical theism a better explanation of what we find there?
That's an interesting question. So, on the one hand, we have this thesis where people think or argue that the God of nature is tantamount to nature. It's a kind of pantheistic understanding. Matthew Stewart, a philosopher who has a book that has the title is Nature's God and the subtitle is The Heretical Origins of American Politics, or something along those lines, argues explicitly that this is all heretical from the Christian perspective, and that it all undermines or subverts a classical theological tradition. That may have been true for some individual members of the Constitutional Convention or here at Continental Congress. So we're not arguing based on each individual founder what they thought or didn't think about these things. But as a whole, I think what they're actually arguing for, and what you see through the document as a whole, is that this God that's identified with the God of nature is also a creator, identified as a creator, is also provident, is also a supreme judge of the world. And I think those attributes and characteristics coincide with a classical theistic understanding of God and his nature and how those attributes, and then also are not exclusive to, but also coincide with the Christian tradition and what we might call the classical Christian natural law tradition in terms of understanding God as the source of and the authority for the natural law and the derivative rights of nature that come from the natural law. But that's one way of understanding it. There are certainly other ways, and so we're trying to make a case for the primacy of the classical tradition in terms of understanding what's going on in that document.
Sure. And you had in that room Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Catholic, Quakers, Presbyterians. This was relatively diverse by the times, and so to say something about what they held in common in terms of their Christian beliefs was a bit of a challenge.
I think it's a bit of a challenge, but it's a lot of the debates that were going on and that led to the Reformation at this point in time had not yet touched some of the arguments about our knowledge of God, what we know by reason, what we know by revelation, what the moral knowledge that we might have by nature would be. A lot of that is still left untouched. And so I think cutting across a lot of these denominational traditions is still a fairly unified understanding of the natural law tradition. And this is stuff that a lot of Protestant natural law scholars have done good work on in recent years in identifying the continuity in the scholastic tradition that's adopted by and the natural law tradition adopted by the Protestant reformers. I think you see some of that at work here. So if you go back and look at the moral philosophy curriculum in the colonial colleges during the period of time in which the founders were being educated, despite the denominational differences, you can go to the Presbyterian College of New Jersey and you can see the Anglican University in New York, and you go to Yale and Brown and go all over. There's a fairly common curriculum being taught in terms of moral philosophy, and it's not divergent in the way that their answers to ecclesiological questions are divergent. And so I think something like that is going on here. And so when you see the statements made in the Declaration of Independence, these are statements made that are intentionally inclusive of all of the different denominational differences that are represented at the convention or in Congress.
And what
Yeah, and
about
I would just add that, to kind of underscore Justin's points, that why classical theism is a better explanation. The a pantheistic God is not an active, distinct being with the exercising legislative, executive, judicial functions. The God legislates the laws of nature. God is appealed to as the enforcer of these laws, and appealed to as a righteous judge among those those who are bound to uphold it. So I think that strikes me as much better. There's much better evidence for a classical theistic view than a pantheistic view in the words of the Declaration itself.
One of our anonymous attendees asked whether the state constitutions give more force to this argument, and whether the finding of Donald Lutz's article, he had this article in 1983 that's really important here, add to the argument. And I guess I would add here, we're talking about 1776, and so we're not quite yet at the state constitution writing phase. But when the states start to write their constitutions, you do get a richer view and understanding of both natural law and the place of God in state government constitutions and how they're writing these things. And Donald Lutz, a political scientist at the University of Houston, wrote an article in the 1980s in the American Political Science Review where he tries to do a quantitative analysis of founding era political sources and what they're drawing from. And contrary to, I think, the main thing that underlies this subversive theology thesis that we were talking about is an overemphasis on the role of some of the early modern philosophers and a particular reading of those early modern philosophers. But what Donald Lutz finds, he takes all of the political pamphlets in the founding era, he takes a sample from them, and then he excludes political sermons from the founding era. And then he does a quantitative analysis of the sources that they're drawing from. And when he gets to the end of this, you find out that John Locke's influence, at least measured in this way, is not as large as we would probably think it is. Montesquieu gets cited far more than John Locke does, and later in the debates as we start talking about constitutionalism. But the single source that's the most cited in all of the political debates is Deuteronomy. And it's Deuteronomy for all sorts of reasons, but because of the political lessons that are taught by it. But the Bible is still the dominant source of political wisdom for the founders and for the people who are arguing in this era. And it still has an outsized influence on American political thought.
Yeah, and I think it's Donald Lutz who discusses that something like 75% of Americans were in Reformed churches, with a heavy emphasis on the Old Testament. So every Sunday they're getting sermons on Deuteronomy and the like. So it's part of
Yep.
their lingo. It's part of the way they think.
Right, right. And that's what, a lot of the debates among scholars will have to do with what's going on in the sermons and what's going on with the pastors. And there are all sorts of interpretations of the pastors as being Lockean and influencing discourse in that way. But I think what you see actually is a pretty broad range of sources that are being appealed to. The mere fact that they're cited doesn't mean that they're cited positively. And so that's why we have to read the sources and read them carefully, because a lot of times they actually do take issue with Locke. They're not afraid. A lot of the founders are not afraid to criticize Locke when they think he's astray. They also cite the Bible often, but they're not simply citing biblical sources. They're engaging with philosophy, and those things are interacting in different ways. And so there is a subtle interpretation that goes on here, and this is why we get to debate these things for generation after generation.
Now, when it came to justifying the actual violence of the revolution, what were the arguments regarding the legitimacy of authority that came up, especially in light of Romans 13 and the kind of traditional Christian understanding that, as a general rule, you submit to rightful authorities?
Well, yeah, this was for me one of the big motivating questions of the project, of something that Justin and I and friends and colleagues and mentors of ours have kind of discussed and debated over the years about, was the American Revolution really justified? and uh, and so I was like, well, maybe I should write a book and try to see what I think. I think that what is striking is, so we do give attention to the sort of pastor side of the influential sort of Christian leader voices within the context of the clergy, someone like Jonathan Mayhew and others, and talk about how they represent an interpretation of Romans 13 that, as you say, you can see among the patristic fathers, the medieval masters, even up to the early reformers, a strong emphasis on obedience to authority and a kind of a leaning into the witness of martyrdom when in the face of injustice, and yet there is this tradition of the civil authority can go too far. Peter says, in Acts, we must obey God rather than men. So, and even reading Romans 13, there's a way of reading it in the Christian tradition that suggests he's intimating limits to authority within the text itself. And I think that it's striking how Protestants and Catholics following the Reformation, the sort of subsequent couple generations, start to develop resistance kind of interpretations of Romans 13 in light of the historical situation where you have increasing either Catholic or Protestant absolutism, whether that's in France or whether that's in England or wherever you are, and you have Protestant or Catholic minorities, and sort of side by side you have this the sort of development of thinking about Romans 13, but perhaps being compatible with some form of civil disobedience, perhaps a resistance. So we sort of argue that Mayhew offers a reading that is within the reasonable ambit of interpretation, historically speaking, across Protestant and Catholic divides, of Romans 13 as a matter of biblical interpretation. And some scholars have tried to argue, oh no, Mayhew, that's just all heretical. And some scholars who argue this don't actually set forth the criteria of orthodoxy, so it's not entirely clear what is meant when that is said. But I think the standard that we set forth, the historical creeds of Christianity that unite broadly Christians across traditions, we make the case that it is a reasonable reading of Romans 13 that one can make the case for. So, yeah.
And you see sources that predate the American Revolution that argue this, and one of those is Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, which clearly identifies the idea in the document, and the founders are aware of this and cite it, but the idea that the political authority is under law and is not necessarily the source of law and rules by law, and it presents the possibility, the theoretical possibility, that you might have an illegitimate authority, that you have an authority that is ruling outside or trying to rule outside of the established law and has made themselves unlawful in a way. And so the question of revolution often has to do with an unlawful, or does have to do with an unlawful political authority. And so if you are justified, what qualitatively distinguishes revolution from rebellion? And rebellion is against a lawful authority. Revolution is against an unlawful authority. What does it mean for the authority to be unlawful? And if the authority is itself the source of law, then there's no theoretical possibility of it ever being unlawful. But the American founders argue that the political authority had made itself, through its actions, unlawful, and therefore they were justified in their revolution as opposed to executing an unlawful rebellion. And a lot of those ideas are packed within the political sermons. I mean, the political ideas are primarily passed on through the clergy and through political sermons. And there's a theological tradition that predates the American Revolution that argues exactly that point. And so it's not a case in which they are fashioning an argument for the occasion, but rather they're fashioning onto arguments that had been made in very different times and places as people interpreted Romans 13 and thought about what Christian obligation to obey established authorities meant in the face of tyranny. Is that really the case, that you have to obey a tyranny? And the Christian answer by and large was no, because tyrannies are not authoritative, that they have forfeited their right to authority by their cruel and unlawful actions. And the American founders are arguing something very similar to that and trying to square it because of their traditions that they operate within, trying to square that with Romans 13.
Let's move on to the conduct of the war itself. And so the founding fathers are engaged in diplomacy and counterintelligence and all of the things that go along with war. What do we see there in terms of they're in the heat of battle, or maybe not battle itself, but in the heat of the war, and all those the goings on? What do we see in terms of their ideas of providence? So that is an act of God.
Luke, I'm starting to get the sense that you read this whole book.
I did.
That's impressive. Kody, this is your chapter.
Yeah. So, there is, in just war theory, there's two lines of inquiry: the justice, jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war, and then jus in bello, which is the conduct of the war within the war itself. And so, just to be clear, we don't exhaustively investigate the jus in bello questions in the book. There are various historical episodes where you can make the case that there were failings to live up to these principles on both sides of the war. But at any rate, just saying, with that said, with regard to counterintelligence in the war, it's a really important theme that's not often remarked upon in the literature, about how much the Americans needed good intelligence to be able to. They had home field advantage, yes, but they still needed intelligence about British troop movements and to be able to act against a superior force, and so Washington deployed spy networks, the Culper spy ring in New York and others across the country, and they fed him very important intelligence that were at crucial points of the war. And the reason why we looked into this specific question of counterintelligence and also diplomacy to France was Congress, toward the tail end of the war, at the end of the war, made these declarations, that official pronouncements, saying, thanking kind Providence for its signal interpositions on our behalf. And they say, of which we'll just mention a couple examples: discovering the counsels of our enemies, raising for us up a powerful ally in France, and turning the evil of British cruelty in the Southern Theater to the good of our unity. Okay, so those are three interesting things to look at. The subversive theology thesis a way of taking that would be like, that's just kind of post hoc rationalization. It's just kind of giving a kind of pious spin after the fact, which is, I think, a serious hypothesis that needs to be taken seriously. So I kind of thought, well, let's look at the actors in these events, and see what they said. Not necessarily, and we're not necessarily the sort of A-list founders of the highly educated Jeffersons and Madisons and Hamiltons of the world. Of course, they're very important, but what this takes us into is kind of a second or third tier of founders, someone like Silas Deane, but also, kind of just common folks on the ground that are Washington's spies. And what you find, I think what is very striking is that at various key moments in events, when Washington's spies are nearly caught, they reveal their view of the world. And so there was this one example, Abraham Woodhull, as I recall, he was sort of posing as a farmer going in and out of New York City, and one time he got shook down by, it was either British troops or people acting on behalf of the troops looking for contraband. And he actually, and funnily enough, he actually was getting supplied invisible ink, so maybe they wouldn't be able to figure it out if they did find it, but there was a cipher and all this sort of thing. But in one of his letters to Washington, he says, "Thank kind Providence they didn't search my boot." and he appeals explicitly to his faith in Christ and these various things, and he understands himself as a player within a divine drama. And whether it's true or not, that's I think a distinct question. Is there strong evidence that these people actually believed it? I think yes. And similarly with the diplomacy mission to France, which is, we kind of often have just a very high school, like, surface knowledge of, it was important, we needed that. But if you actually get into the details of it, the unlikelihood in the abstract of a Catholic monarchy siding with the predominantly Protestant republic, this upstart, and what you find is that the American diplomats appeal to Providence. They appeal to, and again, it's possible that it could just be a kind of Machiavellian, what's going to work, but in their private letters, it doesn't seem that way. It seems like their interlocutors, their French counterparts, also believe that this moment God has providentially willed to bring together France and America for the sake of some higher purpose. And so anyway, they make appeals to these principles, and in addition to realpolitik concerns, and trying to convince France to come to America's aid. And indeed, that aid turns out to be a mass smuggling operation of arms and materiel, turns out to be the decisive factor at Saratoga. The thing that without which we likely would not have won, the turning point of the war, in which now America is credible. Okay, now we'll send over the French Navy. Very important. And similarly, when you look at the Southern campaign and the way that key battles and events took place down there, there were some key battles that, if you look at the letters among the generals, when they occur, after they occur, are interpreted as, oh, look, this is clearly a sign of God's favor.
And let's talk about a couple other things before we close. The idea of popular sovereignty. I think it's generally associated with Rousseau, and you have a long explanation of that, but how is a little different in the American context?
Well, one note, and then let Kody address some of the constitutional questions. But as we mentioned earlier, when we were thinking about what a classical natural law framework would entail, one of the things that it would entail is that might does not make right. And in the context of a society in which you're thinking of the ruler, it's usually you're thinking singular, the ruler, and might does not make right. If we transfer that to a society, democratic or a Republican society, where the people are the source of authority, are the people constrained or bound in some way? Or do we think that the people are the source of right? And the American founders, we argue, understood the dilemma and nonetheless thought that even when the people are sovereign, and even when you have a conception of political sovereignty in which the people rule, the people are nonetheless bound by a higher law. And there's a long tradition of people thinking about the idea of a higher law in American politics and what that entails. But this is not the Rousseauian sovereign. This is not the general will that you get in Rousseau. It's something different altogether. And I think it's a general will or a popular sovereign that is nonetheless constrained by the norms of natural law. And so that's what we get into in this chapter on political sovereignty and the sovereignty of the people, and what that entails about the Constitution and what it presupposes about political sovereignty.
Yeah, I think that Justin stated it well. And, it just going back to thinking about this, I do think it is striking how Rousseau, in the work of Patrick Riley, the book, the General Will Before Rousseau, I think is the name of the book. Very interesting book that tries to show how Rousseau kind of stole some ideas from Pascal's Christianity. He liked the idea of the body of Christ being this sort of unified thing. He's like, yeah, I want that for politics. And it's like, and so, there is, and you see this as a theme in modern sovereignty of trying to take throughout several ways of modernity. You can see attempt to secularize Christian concepts and apply them in a way that is not the way that classical Christianity conceived it. The absolute state, or in Marxism, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Well, that was in Acts, and that was a principle for a voluntary Christian community, not a totalitarian state where, by force of guns, your property is taken and redistributed. But right, the idea though is there's these powerful concepts within Judeo-Christian revelation that are coveted by modern political theorists. And I guess the point that we try to make is that, if you understand modern enlightenment and as in this sort of radical vein, the founders didn't take it that way. The concepts of sovereignty they saw as tethered to the limits of moral law. They reject voluntarism. They reject the idea that the will itself, just in the act of choosing, is determinative of the good and the right. That there's an objective good and right that is prior to acts of willing, if you will. And so anyway, we find evidence for this idea in the constitutional debates and how the founders thought about what we the people was going to mean, and the understanding of the sovereign as sort of tethered or bound. And I do think that's an important lesson to learn for today. I think that people tend to think that, oh well, whenever the majority in democracy says, especially if it's the overwhelming majority, that's just going to be our truth. Oliver Wendell Holmes says, truth is just it's just that idea that can lick all the others. Well, that kind of subjectivist view, like what are the sort of most powerful group, is completely antithetical to our constitutional tradition, in which there is objective truth and goodness, moral principles, that the people's rightful authority, of which they have a broad authority to arrange their affairs, to judge matters of policy, to deliberate about them, to arrange their constitutional offices. There's a significant amount of authority there, but it's not unlimited, and it's not just whichever one can lick the others.
Sorry, I'm moving around the office as the sun chases me. I've got the window open, so I'm trying to find a place to sit here. We have not really mentioned this yet, but a big part of the book, and in terms of the theoretical framework that we employ, has to do with Thomas Hobbes. And we hadn't mentioned Thomas Hobbes, but a lot of the ideas that Kody was talking about, and even I think if you find somebody like Oliver Wendell Holmes, they're operating downstream from some of the ideas that you find exemplified by Thomas Hobbes. And we use the phrase Hobbist because that's the phrase that the founders used, and some of the others, to denigrate this general worldview that you find in Thomas Hobbes. But the general worldview is that all is matter, that there is nothing apart from matter. We can analyze and understand everything in terms of matter. And if that's true, if everything, as Hobbes says, is matter in motion, including our thoughts, we can understand them based on atoms colliding or whatever it is, then when we describe something as bad or good, what we're really describing is some subjective state that we experience. And if that's the case, then there is no objective moral norm that we could understand by reason. And therefore, everything would be about power. And we table the questions of whether that's really what Hobbes thought and whether that's the best interpretation of Hobbes or not. But that's what the founders thought that Hobbes thought, and they called it Hobbism. And they were very happy to denigrate that worldview. And there's one example of that where Alexander Hamilton, who's young, 19, 20 years old, we don't really know how old he was. We don't, based on, we still debate the right year of Hamilton's birth. But Hamilton comes over, he's going to the King's College. He's trying to graduate early, as we know from the Hamilton musical. And he's engaging in pamphlet debates. And there's a royalist bishop that he engages with, Samuel Seabury. And in his criticism of Seabury, he writes that Seabury is a disciple of Thomas Hobbes. And he does it in a way that it's a put down. If there's anything that's a put down in 18th century political pamphlets in the United States, it's to call somebody a disciple of Thomas Hobbes. And so they're well aware of this alternative way of thinking, and they're very careful to criticize that way of thinking. Now, for the scholars that we engage with, they're of course aware of this too. And their interpretation is one in which the founders are very, very quietly disciples of Thomas Hobbes. But we just don't think that that's accurate in terms of what's going on in the public debate at the time.
And I want to ask a question about James Wilson. So you spend a lot of time on him. Could you explain who James Wilson is, his lectures on law, and what it is he had to say? We see the subversive theology thesis arising in interpretations of James Wilson, but explain how we can understand the proper way of understanding James Wilson.
There were two different thinkers that we attributed significance to and devoted whole chapters to. And the reason was because they both challenged our thesis in different ways. One was Thomas Jefferson. And we've talked a little bit about Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, but the reason Jefferson challenges our thesis is because he is heterodox in his religious beliefs. He's not afraid to share his views of the Trinity and of other things in his private letters, and we know that he was not an Orthodox Christian. Nonetheless, we think that he subscribed to something that had some continuity with the classical natural law tradition, including the emphasis on creation that he puts in the original rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. But then we pivot to James Wilson, and Wilson offers a different kind of challenge to us because he is more openly pious in his orientation, and interpreters have seen him as much more connected to the classical tradition. And even as Ellis Sandoz interprets him as a kind of Thomist, or continuity from the Thomist tradition. James Wilson's also interesting for another reason, and it's because he's a kind of forgotten founder. He was one of only 6 people to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was one of the first members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he was also the first chair of jurisprudence or law at the University of, I think it was the University of Philadelphia, which is now Penn. He died in the 1790s, and he was evading creditors, and he got underwater on some things, and the circumstances surrounding his death, I think, led to a point where his influence on the founding was forgotten for many years. He didn't have the kind of hagiography surrounding his life that some of the other founders have. Nonetheless, he was extremely important. He was important at the Constitutional Convention. He was important in the ratification debates in Pennsylvania. He was important as a member of the Supreme Court. But what we focus on in the chapter is his lectures on law. And he wrote a series of lectures on law when he was first named the professor at the University of Philadelphia. He was a sitting Supreme Court justice at the time. But he envisioned that his lectures would be for American lawyers like Blackstone's commentaries was for English common lawyers. And so he was really thoughtful in how he put these lectures together, and he wanted them to educate a generation of American lawyers about the foundations of American jurisprudence. And when you look at some of the public documents and newspaper articles that announce his inaugural lecture, you find out that he gave this inaugural lecture in Philadelphia when the US Capitol was still in Philadelphia, in front of the president, the first lady, the vice president, both houses of the US Congress and both houses of the state legislature. So if you can imagine being inaugural, the inaugural chair of law at some university and then giving your lecture to the entire US government. And so he does that. And if you look at his first lectures, both the one that he gives in that inaugural lecture and then the one that he gives to his students, he has about 50 lectures that he gives to a small group of students, and they're collected together in a Liberty Fund collection, the lectures on law. And what he does is he starts by teaching his students about law. He starts with these deep theological questions that we've already addressed. William Blackstone had identified, or he had defined law as a rule given by a superior to an inferior. And Wilson starts with that. And he says, well, that's true in a way, but it's not true if we think that a superior means that physical force alone is a source of authority. And then he goes on and he talks about that strength alone does not confer authority, that God's sovereignty entails a unity of power and goodness. And then he asks how we know these things about God. And he talks about the division between reason and revelation. And he cites different authorities. So he gets into all of these deep questions in his lectures on law. And he does so in a way that's self-consciously trying to create a generation of lawyers who understand the foundations of American jurisprudence in the same way that Blackstone was teaching a generation of common lawyers about the foundations of English jurisprudence.
I want to turn down to, we have a question that came in. And it says, do you know of any similar themed works in progress? I don't recall that you recommended books in your book. I've read Jaffa, Thomas West, Robert Riley. What else should I consider?
And so the one I was thinking about, actually, I saw that question was our friend Paul DeHart has a book, and it's coming out very soon with the University of Missouri Press, and it's called The Social Contract in the Ruins, Natural Law and Government by Consent. And so Paul's a professor at Texas State University, did graduate school as Kody and I did it at the University of Texas. And he's working on these kinds of questions and thinking about whether the social contract makes sense. And we didn't get a lot into that today, but that's also part of the debate. How much can you have the idea of a social contract and have a law that's higher than the contract? Can people just by willing enter into an agreement and create a sovereign authority, or is there something above and beyond the mere act of willing? And Paul really gets into that in this new book coming out with the University of Missouri Press. So I'd recommend that one as something new on the horizon. And then, of course, Robert Riley. If I disagree with him on anything, I haven't found it yet. The Robert Riley book is very good.
All right, thank you. Thank you both for joining us. Is there somewhere that people can go to find out more about you and your work?
Kody, how about you?
Well, I don't really post that much, but I am on X, I guess it's called now. There I do some popular writing. So you can find me on there at Dr. Kody Cooper. Yeah.
I am not on social media, but I am the director of the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas. And so civitas.utexas.edu. I am the interim dean of the School of Civic Leadership, which we're in the process of building, but we will by Friday have a website that is civicleadership.utexas.edu. So take a look at those two things and our project there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to our sponsors, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman through the Kirk Center website at kirkcenter.org/donate. Go to kirkcenter.org/permanent-things to sign up for the Kirk Center website email list. Next time on the Book Gallery, just in time for Halloween, we will discuss Russell Kirk's best-selling book, Not the Conservative Mind, but Old House of Fear, a novel in the Gothic genre that established Kirk as one of the kings of 20th century horror, honored by T.S. Eliot and Stephen King. It is a book of what Kirk called fearful joy, best read by candlelight in an isolated country house after the river has washed out the bridge, with rain pelting the window and wind howling outside. I'll see you then.